My fellow Americans, welcome to The Celluloid President, the podcast about American presidents on film. Today we're discussing Steven Spielberg's Amistad, which depicts not one, but two presidents, John Quincy Adams and Martin Van Buren.
You and this young so-called lawyer have proven you know what they are. They're Africans. Congratulations. What you don't know is who they are.
This could take us all one long step closer to civil war.
Immediately surrender these goods!
I'm Gary Holmes, and joining me today via Zoom from California is Jim Robinson, who's just trying to drink his brandy after a very long day. Happy New Year, Jim.
Well, I'm sitting here sipping a Diet Dr. Pepper, not a brandy, Gary. Brandy probably a healthier drink, but
Yeah,
nonetheless, Happy
it
New
sure
Year to
is.
you too.
Yeah.
Did you make any New Year's resolutions? Come clean.
I did not. I did
No,
not. I did
I
not.
just made one.
What
I
was
just made
that?
one to completely ignore all the politics coming up in 2024. We'll see how long this lasts.
I think you've already broken it based on the emails that you've already sent me.
Well, yeah,
Obsessing
and it's
about.
only January 3rd, so that's, maybe a record for my New Year's
I know
resolutions.
that was long blown. I mean, to the extent that I made any New Year's resolution, it was to lose all the weight that I gained over Christmas, which was substantial.
You're not alone.
Yeah. All right. Well, look, John Quincy Adams was our sixth president, and Martin Van Buren was our eighth. These are the two guys that you and I have never talked about, so I don't know what your opinions are, but I know I have a lot of opinions. Do you?
Well, I've got to admit, Gary, that between Jefferson and Lincoln, the bunch of presidents between them sort of are a blur to me. I'm more familiar with the big conflicts over the expansion of the country, slavery, industrialization, economic development, those kinds of things that happened during that period, rather than which president did this, that, or the other. Are you trying to tell me you're a John Quincy Adams or Martin Van Buren expert? Do such a thing exist?
I'm not an expert, but I feel like they're my friends. As you know, I've been obsessed with the presidents since I was in the fifth grade, and I've read little bios of them, and so I take sides. I have opinions about William Henry Harrison.
Well, what I'm wondering is, has anyone ever seen Gary Holmes and John Quincy Adams in the same room? Because you sort of look alike.
Yes. Well, as you can imagine, I am more of a John Quincy Adams fan than I am a Martin Van Buren fan. John Quincy Adams was the original Nepo baby, since his dad was our second president. He was a one-term president who didn't accomplish much because he was too self-righteous and inflexible. He was drowning in his own rectitude and couldn't cut deals. He was a classic Puritan with a poker up his ass, but he was a guy who accomplished a lot more before he was president and then after he was president than he did when he was actually president. He was one of our most important diplomats. He was a negotiator overseas, and he was the Secretary of State for John James Monroe, and he wrote the Monroe Doctrine, which we all know what that's all about. And then after he was president, he was elected to this House of Representatives, where he was a leading opponent of the slave states. So there's that.
Yeah, that was my impression on what little I do know, and that it was a pretty mediocre presidency. He was never really a popular guy. I'm sure you know how he got to the presidency the first time in 1824. Not only did he lose the popular vote, he lost the electoral college vote to Jackson, and it was the House of Representatives that chose him because no one had a majority. And then 4 years later, he got walloped by Andrew Jackson in both the popular and electoral college vote. I sort of see him as the proverbial career politician, the precursor to what we would call a career politician, always has to have an office.
Right.
And so he would run for anything he could, whether it was at the state level or the national level. And, so that's sort of my impression of him. I don't have negative feelings, but, he was sort of like a so what. I do think you're right. He was much more impactful as a Secretary of State and also in the aftermath in his stance against slavery. What about Van Buren? Don't tell me you're an expert on him too.
Well, I have a little bit of a fun fact. He was the only president whose first language was not English, it was Dutch.
Oh yeah.
He was a working class boy and a political genius, together with Andrew Jackson, who's much better known. He created the Democratic Party. It's hard to remember now, but for over 100 years, the Democrats were the party of slavery and segregation because their base was the white working class who were afraid of free blacks would take their jobs. So he was also a one-term president, but because he and Jackson had abolished the national bank, which tanked the economy and brought about a recession.
Yeah, don't you think the movie probably treated him a little unfairly in terms of, I know they wanted a counterpoint to John Quincy Adams. Adams was the hero president, and the villain president, or weak president, if you will, was Van Buren. And I'm not sure that was totally fair.
I was going to talk about this later when we talked about the performance, but I do agree that they treated him unfairly, not from the political standpoint, because I think he probably, I mean, it's a fact that he appealed this decision to make the South happy, but he was, they make him look like kind of a fop or, very supercilious, not a very serious person. And, he was extremely Machiavellian, and he was, considered they called him the sly fox. He was also a career politician, an actual
Right.
guy who
He was like a boss.
Yeah, he was the
Political
first
boss.
party boss, right? From New York State. I've been to his house.
Come on.
No. Twice even.
Twice. My God. Get a life.
I'll tell you.
Where is it?
It's halfway between your house and my house. And twice when I
Okay.
went to Glens Falls, I stopped, it's 20 miles south of Albany. And if you drive up 9A, it's right there. And I drove off, and I didn't go inside the house because that, it wasn't open. But I mean, it's this gigantic mansion. It's got its own name, Lindenwald. It has 36 rooms. It's one of these days I want to go see it. So we should rendezvous this sometime there and take a tour of Lindenwald.
Yeah, and then we should do Hyde Park too, because I've never done that.
Yeah. Now I've never
Along
been
the
to
Hudson.
I've never been to John Quincy Adams' house in Quincy, which is a shame because I grew up really close to there.
Yeah.
But during a family trip to Washington D.C. when I was 12 years old, we took a tour of the U.S. Capitol, and they brought us to the old House of Representatives, and the tour guide showed us where John Quincy Adams had his desk, and while he was sitting there in the 1840s, he had a stroke and died. No, he didn't die right on the floor there, but they moved him into another room on the Capitol, and he died in the House of Representatives. So
Yeah, I didn't even know that.
yeah,
That's pretty creepy.
yeah. And the other thing, if you're on that tour, this is the kind of thing I remember, of course, from 60 years ago. If you're on that tour, his desk was under the dome in a certain way so that he could hear what people were talking about over there, and so that the sound would bounce from the floor up to the dome and down to his.
Oh, I do remember that.
Yeah, you remember that? Okay.
Yeah.
So the guide gave us, he went over there and he talked into the floor and we could hear him. So that was, that's the two trivial facts about John Quincy Adams.
Well, Gary, you know that we have kind of a New York, Massachusetts rivalry and a Yankees Red Sox rivalry.
Yeah.
So let's extend that to our Van Buren, John Quincy Adams rivalry by me just pointing out that it seems like Van Buren too got some religion in terms of being anti-slavery later in his career. And in fact, one of the reasons he lost support of the Democratic Party during his presidency is because he was absolutely opposed to admitting Texas as a slave state. So as I said, and we'll talk a little more about the history later, I do think that his portrayal in this movie was a little bit unfair, but I'm not arguing he's one of our pantheon of presidents who belongs in Mount Rushmore.
Yeah, I don't really have a grudge against Van Buren like I do against like John Tyler and Jefferson. So I have my favorites. I like John Quincy Adams. Poker up his ass or not. I just
Well,
Puritans
once
are
I get past Eisenhower and Nixon, it's hard for me to come up with great ones.
okay. So look, we've alluded to the movie, but why don't you tell us what it's about?
Sure. The film tells the story of a group of West African Mende tribesmen who in 1839 were kidnapped and shipped off to Cuba and later ended up in a schooner called the Amistad to be sold as slaves, even though the transatlantic slave trade had been illegal for years. Led by Cinque, a tribesman, the group seizes control of the ship, killing most of the crew. They are later picked up in US waters and end up imprisoned in Connecticut. A lengthy legal and courtroom battle ensues, with many assuming that they were just escaped slaves who mutinied and should be returned to Spanish controlled Cuba for punishment. Bigwigs get involved, including President Van Buren and the government of Spain and its girl queen, Isabella. Despite massive communications and cultural barriers between the Africans and their lawyers, they actually prevail at the trial and start to celebrate their freedom, but not so fast. Government prosecutors appeal to the US Supreme Court at the behest of the president, which happens to be comprised of mostly Southern slave owners. That's when the aged former President John Quincy Adams is enlisted to personally argue the Africans' case. Improbably, the court finds that the group were not escaped slaves from Cuba, but rather free Africans who had been illegally kidnapped. And so they were set free to return to their homeland.
Okay, very good. Very good. I'll tell you that the movie made $44 million in 1997. That would rank it in the mid 50s for the year, on par with the Full Monty.
Oh, that's good company.
Yeah, I mean, someone who did not do the Full Monty, and this was John Quincy Adams, that's for sure. For comparison's sake, the number one movie of 1997 was Men in Black, which earned 250 million at the box office. And the other top movies of the year were The Lost World, Jurassic Park, Liar Liar, a reissue of the original Star Wars movie, and another movie about a very different president, Air Force One.
An action hero president.
An action hero president, yeah, starring Harrison Ford.
But Gary, wouldn't it be great to be Steven Spielberg? Because when you look at all those blockbusters, and he had already proven his bona fides in doing some blockbusters, but he basically got to the point, obviously well before this, where he could do anything he wanted to, and have enough of a name to still make some money and do really quality films without having to worry about scratching the latest pop culture itch.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's been almost 30 years now since he's been able to make whatever movie he wanted. And he just, very recently he made a movie about his childhood, and they're like, okay, here you go. Here's, $30 million or whatever it took to make the movie. So,
Yeah.
yeah. The movie was nominated for 4 Academy Awards, including Best Supporting Actor Anthony Hopkins. But it didn't, it was not. That was a year that Titanic won, and that was a tough year for anyone else. So it did. I think it was well respected, criticized by historians somewhat. We can get into that a little bit later too. Who would you recommend this movie to?
Basically, if you're the kind of person that likes a movie that puts you on a roller coaster of emotions, then I think the film is for you. It's moving, it's horrifying, and it's inspiring all at once. And over the course of it, you're going to feel really awful and you're going to feel really, really good. And so I think if you're the person that likes to really be grabbed by a film and pulled in all directions, I think you're gonna like this movie and want to see it. How
Yeah, and
about you?
also, I mean, history buffs, Civil War enthusiasts, and also Steven Spielberg fans. You know, this is actually the 27th Steven Spielberg movie I've seen. You and I
Holy,
never saw this before, right? You didn't see it before.
I had never seen it before.
Yeah, so all his movies are pretty good. It's hard to believe there's probably 20 other movies that I haven't seen. I mean, he's very prolific, and I think if you're a Steven Spielberg fan and you like that quality of filmmaking, this movie's for you.
Yeah,
But
and
it
I
is
think
rough.
I was gonna say you in this movie you learn a lot about how the institution of slavery operated and sustained itself
Yeah,
in a technical sense. And I don't mean to use technical dryly, in a horrifying technical sense.
yeah.
And so it's educational, actually.
No, it's very
For the,
educational about the legality of slavery. I mean, the nuances of who could be a slave, who wasn't a slave. I mean, you're tempted to call these people, the prisoners who are on trial, slaves, but they technically weren't slaves. I mean, they were they were
right.
they were captured
But
prisoners.
it also, I think, has that universality to the story that people would like. It's a universal story about the very human desire for freedom,
Yep.
whether you're a slave or not, and the desire for home. It's not exactly Wizard of Oz, no place like home, but there's that element in it.
Well, one of the criticisms of the movie that I saw, I wish I had come up with this myself, is that Steven Spielberg has actually remade E.T. with because what you've got that same dynamic. You've got someone who is stranded in a foreign country, can't speak the language. You've got someone in Matthew McConaughey plays the role of Elliot in this movie, and all he wants to do is go home. So it's like Sinkay, go home.
Well,
So
I'm glad I came up with Wizard of Oz then, because that's
yeah,
even
yeah,
more
that's good.
preposterous and clever.
Yeah. All
And
right.
I just thought of that.
I know. I didn't think of it myself. I had to go to a critic. So anyway, what did you like about the movie?
Well, it gets to a point you just made. And one thing I really liked was the presentation of the culture clash between the Africans and the Americans. Each side was looking upon the other, as if they were from another planet, from like they were space aliens. And there were even touches of humor when the Africans, in their own language, would make fun of the American lawyers and the ultra religious people who were praying. And so I thought it was really well done to present the competing perspectives of both sides and the evolution then it showed from zero communications to breaking down those barriers and even bonding between the two sides was a great payoff at the end.
Yeah.
So I really like that about the film.
I like the sideburns. You don't see facial hair like that again until the 1970s. I had sideburns like that when I graduated from high school, and it just goes to show you that each era makes its own embarrassing style choices.
If you grew them back, Gary, then you'd really look like John Quincy
Yeah,
Adams.
I would. Yeah, if I, but I also have to admire. I always admire Steven Spielberg's storytelling technique. It begins like a horror movie.
Yeah.
Extreme close-up of Sinkay's face and hands, which leads to the slave rebellion on board the Amistad. Then it's on to the rest of the movie. And it isn't until halfway through when Sinkay testifies at the trial when we see why the rebellion was justified. The scenes where he and the other prisoners were captured and transported is like under horrifying conditions is some of the rawest scenes I've seen in movie history. Certainly and it shows why these ships were so evil. That a lesser director would have probably started with those scenes, but we would have been desensitized to them by the end. We got to the end. So the way he put this movie together, I thought was really ingenious.
Yeah, I was going to make that almost exactly the same point. I was so relieved when he didn't portray the Atlantic crossing at the beginning of the movie
Yeah.
because I was dreading it, but I knew that an honest movie would have to show it. But the audience needed a chance to settle in, I
Yeah.
think. And I thought that was excellent pacing and, frankly, very kind consideration for the movie audience to wait until we had already gotten into the story before portraying those horrific, terrible scenes, which I agree are some of the worst, scariest things in all of the movies I've ever seen.
Yeah, it's not the kind of thing you expect to see in a Steven Spielberg movie, although he did make a Holocaust movie, and he made that movie about World War II, Saving Private Ryan. So I mean, he
I mean,
is horror.
it was so terrible that you hardly even noticed while it was happening. What we're talking about is the way the newly kidnapped slaves were being treated on board the cross Atlantic ship and whipped all the time and naked and being thrown overboard because they were overweight and all these horrible things. And so terrifying, you almost didn't notice. It was full of frontal nudity
Yeah.
and all that kind of stuff that, people in movie audiences would normally have singled out. You barely even noticed that because it was just so terrible. So I like the pacing of the story, and I'm thankful to Spielberg for it.
Yeah, and he also, I will say the thing about that scene too, he knew when to cut. I mean, anything more than what he showed would have been too overwhelming, and people might have turned. So he has a sense of what audiences are able to accept, and not get turned off by.
I also like Gary, even after all those horrors. I like that it was an inspiring story
Oh
and
yeah,
it came out reasonably all right in the end. The system worked, even in the pre Civil War days, and even with a Supreme Court comprised mostly of slave owners. I mean, so I like that, and I also like that it didn't accentuate, but didn't try to hide the shared blame that the world and the country had for slavery. There were a lot of dirty hands in this dirty business, and it didn't single out, one single villain and overdo it.
no, I mean
And
it showed very clearly that that the slaves were initially imprisoned by African
other
tribes.
blacks, yeah, right. And also, it didn't. I appreciated that it didn't try to sort of cheaply attach what happened then to today's racial disputes.
Right.
I know that's always a temptation. In fact, if it was made today, that might be
Yeah.
a temptation to succumb to. No cheap parallels, it just tells the story,
Yeah.
and the story speaks for itself.
Something else I liked about the movie, and I liked, it was all set in New England, and I really enjoyed that.
Mhm.
It was shot in Newport, Rhode Island, and Mystic, Connecticut, both of which I've been to. So it's always, it's fun to recognize locations in the movies. My wife was very excited to see that they used the Rhode Island State House where she used to work as a stand-in for the U.S. Capitol, and she was very happy to point out to me that I used to have that office right there. So,
Oh, that's cool. I didn't
that
I
was
didn't
cool.
know that. Yeah.
I also enjoyed thinking about the legal issues that were involved in this trial, and you talked about it as being a learning experience, and yeah, I was, it was a complicated legal movie because, as you said, these prisoners could not be legally slaves if they were proven to have been taken prisoner in Africa because of international treaties outlawing the slave trade. Only children born to existing slaves could be considered property. So, and it highlights how perverse the system was. But interesting to see how people thought in the 1830s and how to work out these legal issues. So yeah, it was very interesting.
Yeah, and it was multifaceted. There was, of course, the defendants claim that they were free Africans who were kidnapped
Right.
and therefore had a right to insurrection on the ship. There was there were the U.S. Personnel that found them in U.S. waters that tried to claim they were salvage, part of this
Right,
salvage
right.
operation, like gold doubloons that were found in a sunken ship. And then, of course, there were the surviving Spanish crew who claimed that they were their property, as slaves in their custodianship.
And
So
then there was the Spanish government itself claiming that it was their contraband,
it
that
was part of trade,
it's part
part
of
of
trade. Yeah.
trade in goods.
Right. Right.
So it
So
was all these, it was grotesque in a way and absurd and almost humorous in a way, but competing claims.
yeah.
Interesting.
Well, that scene in the courtroom where one party comes in after the other, Your Honor, I'm the true owner of this property,
Right.
it was actually humorous in a
Yeah, it was.
reverse kind of way.
Yeah.
What about any dislikes?
Well, a couple of the dislikes I have are kind of flip sides to my likes. So I mentioned I like the culture clash,
Yeah.
the presentation of the culture clash between the Africans and Americans. But, and tell me if you had the same reaction, and maybe this is modern day sensibilities. It felt a little like that they kept making the Africans look too childish,
Yeah.
using only emotion and outbursts rather than reason and thinking. And I thought that got a little overdone to me. And then also um, something I found touching, but then again I wondered about the appropriateness was when the discovery of the Jesus story by Cinque and his compatriot. It seemed a little too pat, a little too facile, as they were sort of, almost making it look like to be, as they were getting civilized, that meant they were adopting Western ways, learning about Christianity and all that. So it just created a little bit of question and uneasiness in my mind. I don't know if you felt that.
I was going to say that the scene where one of the prisoners is telling Cinque about the Jesus story was actually my favorite scene in the movie. So I would jump ahead there.
Yeah, it's not a bad scene. It's just
No,
I
no, no.
wonder what's that saying.
It's also historically accurate. I mean, a lot of those Africans did become missionaries. I mean, they adopted the
Mm-hmm.
religion, and when they went back to Africa, they became, missionaries. I was going to say, well, in a related matter, that one thing I didn't like is how the abolitionists were portrayed. These are my people, Congregationalists. And they're shown as like an ineffectual Greek chorus. They
Kind
didn't,
of fools. They were
yeah,
like
like
fools.
exactly. I mean, they're praying, and all they do is pray and sing, and they're just off like counterpoint to what's really happening. And in fact, these people were actually very hard headed, and they sent missionaries all over the world, and they founded hundreds of congregational churches throughout the Midwest. And you can see at the end, they're the ones who financed the prisoners' return to Africa because the government wouldn't pay them to do it. I mean, they're actually, for all the joking you're doing about them, the same, dozen or so people who are dressed up like old-fashioned Puritans are on the ship when they're going to Africa, and that's because they paid for it. So,
Yeah, well,
uh,
do you think there's a difference? And I don't know the answer to this historically. Isn't there a difference between political abolitionism and religious abolitionism? And maybe he was just portraying, the very religious abolitionists when a lot of the work of the abolitionists was in political movement.
yeah, I think what he's trying to show there, like the abolitionists are the religious abolitionists are one side way over here of idealists, and they're totally ineffectual. And then on the other far side, you've got the slavers and people that are in favor, and our heroes are in the middle, right?
Right, right.
Between. So he's setting up this dynamic where you've got one group of people that are, like airheads almost. They're the kind of people who, I mean, like chain themselves to trees these days and that kind of thing. I'm sure there were people like that were very pious and unrealistic and so forth. But, the supporters of abolition, they were realistic in their own way. But anyway, and another thing that I didn't, as much as I like Steven Spielberg, he is definitely an old-fashioned director relying on Hollywood tropes. So while I admire the storytelling, I'm also aware of there are scenes where he's clearly manipulating us. I mean, you can see it, it's I know what you're doing here, buddy. Um, and I know this never happened in real life, and you've made all this up to make us to manipulate our emotions, and it's just a little too obvious for me after a while that I still like the movie a lot, but it's not a cutting edge movie.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of those tropes are sort of the entertainment touches.
Yeah,
I mean, the introduction of John Quincy Adams by showing him asleep at his desk in the
right,
house,
right.
is a nice little yuckity yuck way to introduce the character. And yeah, I get that point. I didn't like, after praising his pacing of the
Yeah,
story, I actually found the opening scenes aboard the Amistad and the insurrection. I found that really annoying to my senses. They weren't translating the Africans' dialogue at that point. If you notice, they only started translating what they were saying into English with captions later. There was this strobe light effect that's really annoying, and the clatter and clutter of too many noises, and too much darkness and light. Maybe this is an older person's thing, and with their old ears. But I just found it grating and annoying, and I thought, oh my God, I hope the whole movie isn't like this. And it wasn't, but I was worried.
I think what's going on there is that he's basically starting it off like a horror movie.
Yes.
Because I watched it twice, and the second time I noticed, you only see body parts. They look like monsters or orcs, these slaves, and it's like, wow. I mean, and it is very hard to figure out what's going on because you see his fingers, then you see maybe some lips, and then it's horrifying when they all escape. They don't even look human at that point. They look like something out of Lord of the Rings, like the orcs. So it's an interesting choice that he made there, and I think it's shocking us. But it is a little it's hard to figure out what's going on in the beginning, and it is very disorienting, and it's obviously a deliberate thing on his part.
Yeah, I can't imagine audiences settling in with their tubs of popcorn and having that come at them in the first 10 minutes. That's,
Right.
as a
Right.
movie going experience, that's where my complaint is.
All right. Well, let's talk. What do you think the movie's trying to accomplish?
Well, I think he's a good storyteller, and he's trying to tell a gripping and dramatic and sad yet inspiring story about a successful challenge to an evil institution, and how the ultimate underdogs can win against all odds. He's trying to show how evil slavery indeed was. And I think he probably, probably is trying to build this episode up to perhaps more historical importance than it really deserves.
Yeah.
I think he deliberately is trying to do that. Maybe he actually believes it deserves the importance he's giving it. That's sort of what I think's working here.
I think also, the first period of Spielberg's career when he made E.T. and Raiders of the Lost Ark and all those movies, they were mostly adventure movies and movies about kids. Then he did a Holocaust movie, Schindler's List, which was a seriously adult movie, and Amistad comes very soon after that. And I think he's trying to show again that he can be a grown-up director and address serious issues. I also think that he's, a seriously patriotic filmmaker. And this is the first in a series of movies that examines how America is basically America is flawed, but basically decent. We see this again in Saving Private Ryan, the movie Lincoln, which we've already talked about. Post, the Terminal, Bridge of Spies. I mean, he's really, I think he really loves America, and he wants to show it for its flaws, but also its virtues.
Yeah, I agree with that. I thought in a strange way, and maybe this was deliberate or not, the film shows that violence can be justified.
Yeah.
I mean, blowing up that slave factory at the end of the movie is a thrilling moment. It's a stand up and cheer moment, blowing something up. It's a kind of regeneration through violence, which is a common, in fact, American studies books have been written on that theme. It's a common theme in American literature and American culture. And with even the Supreme Court at the end, specifically saying insurrection was justified.
Well, yeah. I mean, you're right. And the very beginning of the movie is extremely violent. More violent. It seems to be more violent than it actually probably was, because when I went and researched it, it found it looks like they're killing 1 million people, but they're actually only killed 3 sailors that on board.
Yeah, and at the end of the movie, that's given the seal of approval by
Yeah.
the U.S. Supreme Court.
But you see, you're right. You have this violence, and it's only later where you understand why it was justified. So yeah, I think you're right about that. Another thing I think he's trying to do, which he showed this in Lincoln, is that progress is made by canny realists like the Matthew McConaughey character here.
Mhm.
And by Lincoln, it's not idealists. Idealism only gets you so far, but you need to be able to cut the deal. And because
Right.
Matthew McConaughey's Matthew McConaughey character who's a lawyer representing them, is focused on the how to win the case. And anyway,
And yet there's one instance where he shows the underside or the extremes of pragmatism when the Morgan Freeman character Jodson is talking to, I can't remember the character's name, but it's one of the abolitionists,
yeah,
one of their compatriots, and that abolitionist is saying, well, maybe it's not such a bad thing if these Africans get sent back to Cuba and get executed, because we could use the martyrs for our cause.
right.
So it shows, referencing what I was talking about earlier with political abolitionism, in the John Brown episode
Right,
and all where
right,
they killed innocent people.
right,
And so I think that's an interesting aspect of this is what do you
right.
need to prevail in
Yeah.
a political
Well,
social
what's
movement?
actually winning? Is winning
Right,
the case winning, or is winning the political point winning?
right. And
We
of
see
course
that
we all,
nowadays
yeah,
all the time. I mean, well, if you get beaten up and it goes viral, you win the case, even though
right.
maybe you've got a cracked head.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about the actors. So this guy Sin K. By the way, his
Yes, go
name Sin
for it,
K.
Gary. Go for it. Pronounce it. I want to hear you pronounce
Oh,
the
look, I
actor.
actually looked it up. But before we talk about, does the name Sin K mean anything to you before this?
It kept ringing a bell, but no.
When Patty Hearst was when Patty Hearst was kidnapped by the Symbionese Liberation Army when we were in college, the head of the Symbionese Liberation Army, the SLA, called himself Commander Sin K.
Okay, all right.
So that's that. I mean, it was like ringing a bell, and I was Googling like crazy, and it finally came up. All right. His name is pronounced uh, Jimon Hansu.
Good, very
So
good.
uh,
I'm going to call him Sin K from now on.
same here. This is his first major role, and he went on to play in several superhero movies, which since I don't go to superhero movies, I didn't know about him. He's also in Gladiator. I thought he was excellent in the role.
I did too. I
Although
did too.
I read online that he never actually learned the Mendi language, so he was faking it a little bit.
He was doing it phonetically, I guess.
Yeah.
And I also read that Spielberg went to huge lengths to do proper casting for this role, and it was almost late in the casting and the pre-production when he finally decided, and he had specific criteria that had to be met for someone that he thought could adequately pull the role off. And I thought Cinquet did a great job.
Yeah, no, it was. I mean, he was. He's called a hero throughout the movie, and he really did play the movie heroically. Anthony Hopkins, last seen by us as Nixon in Oliver Stone's Nixon.
And nominated for an Academy Award there
Yeah,
and here, and not winning.
not winning. He
And I
lost
thought
to Robin Williams.
yeah.
He lost to Robin Williams in Good Will Hunting.
I thought he was excellent, and I thought he was better than he was in Nixon. Maybe that's because we know Nixon, the real Nixon, so well. I thought he did a great job.
I thought he was very good too. Although I think, and this is Spielbergian magic again. No, my guess is that I bet you he was sterner in real life than he is in this movie. I mean, Hopkins plays him like crinkly grandpa with a heart of gold, and I have a feeling that that really wasn't, John Quincy Adams.
Well, from what I know about New Englanders, I think you're right.
No crinkly grandpas in Boston.
Right.
Matthew McConaughey played.
I thought he played, yeah.
Yeah,
Roger Sherman Baldwin. Yeah.
Roger Sherman Baldwin. Yes, related. Well, yeah, I don't know if Roger Sherman means anything to you, but he was the founder of Rhode Island, and apparently this was his grandfather.
I thought he was playing himself.
Yeah.
He was okay. I thought he was basically playing himself, cocky, awkward, and charming all at the same time. And I've seen him like that in other movies. I think that my hunch is that this was kind of a warm-up act for him when he gets to play a real president. And I don't mean a real president in the movies, but a real president, because it's been thought that he has political ambitions, and someday will run for president.
Yeah, I thought he was fine too. I thought he was fine. Of course, it turns out that the real Roger Baldwin was older, more established lawyer who was already an abolitionist. I guess he was about 40 when this happened. McConaughey plays him as a young, sort of ambitious, but this guy actually became a governor of Connecticut. So the idea that he was sacrificing a lot to take on this case and he's losing all his other clients is not really true. I mean, again, this is the kind of Spielbergian thing that you have to do to make the story more palatable. But and it was fine. I mean, if you don't know the history, I mean, it's a good story.
Well, it was refreshing. It was refreshing to have an American actor, wasn't it? Because once again, we have all these Brits, or Brits or Africans transported to Britain in a movie. I don't know what it is. I'm starting to think that our best directors really do believe that the best actors come from Britain and not Hollywood.
Well, speaking of which, Martin Van Buren was played by Nigel Hawthorne. He's
stage actor from the UK.
Yeah, he's also from the UK, and he played. I don't know if you probably never seen this movie, The Madness of King George. He was King George. So
no.
And we've talked about. I thought it was a little unfair how they were. They made him look effete and elitist, but
and buffoonish even.
But we've already talked about how Hopkins has now played 2 American presidents. Nigel Hawthorne played in 3rd, and then we've got Daniel Day-Lewis played Lincoln. So I think you're right. I think these people, that they think that those British actors are better than the Americans.
Well, here's what my speculation, I don't know enough about it, is that I think the British acting class comes up more through the stage, serious stage work, than maybe a lot of American actors. And when you have movies that require intense characterization, some of our best directors and auteurs might feel that they want to look to the British, the very experienced British stage and film actors first, rather than Hollywood actors who might be very good, but just sort of hit it big. They got their breakthrough in Hollywood in a movie, and that's the extent of their backstory.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen what happens when you pick an American actor like Bill Murray playing FDR. It's just not really very believable. Um,
And of
and
course, you've speculated that it might be money might be involved too.
money
Maybe
might be involved.
maybe top American actors are used to commanding more of a salary.
Well, and the other thing too is I think the British are better at accent work. And a lot of
Mm.
times, like Anthony Hopkins had to put on a patrician sounding New England accent, which kind of worked, but I'm not in a position to know what John Quincy Adams actually sounded like. But Matthew McConaughey's New England accent sort of came and went, it was here
Hmm.
and all over the place. So
What
I
do you
don't
think of Morgan Freeman? Morgan Freeman.
Well, of course, that character is not a real person. Everyone else in this movie has their own Wikipedia page except for him. I mean, the characters, Roger Sherman Baldwin has his own Wikipedia page. Morgan Freeman was, completely made up. He's always a very dignified actor and he gets high billing, even though he's in a small part. I don't think he's fine. I mean, not a lot of heavy lifting though. I
I
don't
thought he
think,
was
go
I
ahead.
thought he was really good, and I thought his character was really interesting. He was the man in the middle, and some of his there but for the grace of God go I reactions that he had to what was unfolding before him, and realizing that it was just luck that he was in a position to do what he was doing, as opposed to being in the position of some field hand on a southern plantation, or a kidnapped African wrenched away from his homeland and now potentially getting sent to Cuba for execution. That he he was able to convey in look as much as in lines that sense of fate and luck. I thought just added a really nice added element to the movie. I really liked him in this film.
Well, he's a likable character in the movie, and as I said, he has a lot of dignity. But I think it's pretty clear that Steven Spielberg put him in this movie to show that it wasn't just all white people working to free the slaves, that escaped blacks like him were also part of the liberation process. So
Right.
that sort of leads us into a discussion about history. So, what's your take on how historically accurate it is?
First of all, I wanted to ask you a question and make a confession.
Okay,
Had you ever heard of this Amistad episode or learned about it in school, in high school or college before this movie?
negative,
Same here. So, what does that tell you about its historical importance?
right,
Maybe nothing, but possibly maybe because it isn't as historically important in the broader scheme of things
right,
as the movie makes it out to be. Having said that, from what I can discern, I think on the details that matter,
yeah.
it's pretty accurate on the details and on the sequencing. It's obviously there's embellishments because it's a movie. Um, and I know there are complaints from historians that it's imbued with major turning point ramifications in terms of our institution of slavery that it really doesn't deserve.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think we're completely on the same page here. There's a lot of little things that are inaccurate, like Martin Van Buren wouldn't have been campaigning on a railroad car, or campaigning, period, because presidents didn't campaign back then. They've also got one of my favorite things is they've got Martin Van Buren's office looks like it's in Versailles or something, this gorgeous, huge empty room. When we both know that the president's office in the White House back then was just some cramped room. So there's a lot of little things that are wrong. A lot of it is accurate. Exactly. I mean, the characters, except for Morgan Freeman, are all mostly accurate. But I'm with you. I actually did go back and look. I went through this, I read what's it called? What hath God wrought? It was this history of the antebellum period. And I looked in the index, and sure enough, Amistad is in there. But it was written after this movie came out, and it's just written. The story is summarized in there, just like it's almost like they're summarizing the movie, but it doesn't make any claims about it being, an important thing. And I don't think it advanced the conflict. And the big thing that's wrong is they talk about the Civil War constantly in this movie. This is gonna lead to a civil war, and if you don't, and people weren't thinking like that in 1840. It wasn't really on anyone's radar then.
Or they weren't going to be so ready to bandy about the threat of a civil
Right,
war. No one
right.
was going to say that,
Yeah, I know. So I don't think it caused civil war. I mean, like there's, I mean, you and I took the same history courses. We probably read the same books.
Mhm.
The same factors, like when they let Kansas in as a as a free state, and people went into Kansas and they butchered each other over whether it was going to be free or slave. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Compromise of 1850, all this stuff. John Brown's raid on
Harper's Ferry.
Harper's Ferry, exactly. Those are the Dred Scott decision. All those things were much more, uh,
Well,
inflammatory.
right. Well, just the Mexican War, and all the new territory the United States annexed after winning that war
Right. You
opened
mentioned
up
Texas.
whole new battlefields for whether there'd be slaves or not in those new territories.
Yeah.
Those were the things that really, drove the country to civil war. I think what the other thing historians say is that we've sort of alluded to it is that people really did make distinctions between the types of slavery, between the slave trade and the domestic slave, practice of holding slaves. There were some of the northern colonies would they'd get rid of slavery and claim bona fides, and then you look closely at what did they get rid of? Well, any children of slaves will be free. They didn't get rid of
Right.
the actual, so there were a lot of nuances
Right.
in this whole process. And so the idea that a case involving, as the courts found, not American slaves, but Africans, a case involving citizens or residents of another country, that would have huge ramifications for our domestic institution of slavery, I think is a bit of a stretch.
Well, the fact that they won the case, that the good guys won the case in the Supreme Court, even though they were, six or so slaveholders on the slave owners on the court, shows that it wasn't that big of a deal.
Right.
It was decided on a very narrow technical issue. So
Mm-hmm.
I think the movie's great. I think it does a good job of showing what was going on. But I'm with you. I completely agree that it's making claims that it doesn't really deserve.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, how about your favorite scenes?
Well, I think the runaway number one scene and line, with all others a distant second, has to be when Cinque stands up in the middle of the case and says, "Give us free, give us free," over and over again. That's a spine tingling filmic moment. both in the scene and in the line to me.
Okay. So this is when I talk about him being Spielberg being a cinematic Hollywood kind of director. This is the kind of scene that I just didn't like.
Oh, I
Um,
just thought it was so good.
yeah, I just thought it was phony and Hollywood like. But yeah, I understand that this is supposed to be like the climax, one of the climaxes of the movies, and I get it, but it just that didn't really work for me.
I didn't catch in my reading as to whether he actually did that. I think it's probably accurate historically, isn't it?
I don't know. I don't. I
Yeah.
mean, I
Would would you change your reservation about it if you knew that it actually happened
if it
that
actually
way?
happened, then I would withdraw my objection. But
Okay. Yeah. Well, I don't know that. So
yeah.
I'm just going to sit back and enjoy it in my memory without researching it.
Now, I didn't like your favorite scene. You didn't like my favorite scene, which was when the prisoner's explaining Jesus to Sinkei. Also related to that scene was when the judge is seen praying in the Catholic Church, and then you realize that it's actually the judge there, and he's going to rule in favor of the prisoners. So the role of religion, the role that religion plays in this movie is something you don't really see a lot in Hollywood movies, and certainly not in um, Steven Spielberg movies. He's Jewish, and
Right.
he's he told that Jesus story in a way that I found very inspiring,
Christian.
very
Yeah,
Christian.
I didn't dislike that scene, and I especially the ending of it when Sinkei remarks after he talks about Jesus dying. Sinkei says that's where we're going. You know
After they
when?
kill us.
Yeah, after they kill us. I like that as the payoff, one of the payoffs of the scene, and I like the scene of the judge in his Catholic church is that he was this Catholicism he was supposedly trying to hide and supposedly could be blackmailed over into favorably ruling for the government. And instead, he appealed to his Catholicism and it gave him the strength to side with the African defendants. I like that.
I also liked the scene with Sinkei and the John Quincy Adams house. Now, I bet you my collection of White House Christmas ornaments that this never happened. Um, you know, why would they have taken Sinkei from his jail and moved him all the jail cell, moved him all the way up to Quincy, Massachusetts? But having said that, I thought the bonding that those guys did was very Hollywood, but also very affecting, especially when you saw Sinkei sees that John Quincy Adams has an African violet there, and it reminds him of home again.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah.
very touching scene.
Yeah, I agree. I like the Supreme Court scene, but it started kind of slow. But then as it went on, and Adams started to become eloquent and articulate. He wasn't at first, but he was making his argument. And when he said at one point, "We are, we are, we are who we were," talking about ancestors, and he's standing in front of a bust of his father at that point, and that also echoed what Sinkei said about his ancestors and how he has to prevail in order to honor his ancestors. I ended up liking that scene a lot.
Yeah, I I did feel like though the movie is a little conflicted on what the message is, because early in the movie we see Matthew McConaughey talking on legal grounds and practical grounds, and that John Quincy Adams' speech is not based on legal issues. It's more of an appeal to their the evils of slavery. And I'm sure if he'd really made that speech in person, he wouldn't have won the case. By the way, that speech went on that his speech went on for 7 hours. And
Yeah, I glanced at it, the real
yeah,
speech.
yeah.
I couldn't
I same
focus on it.
here. I
And
found
it
it too,
just
and I was
went,
like, oh, maybe I'll read this and see what he really said. And it's like, oh, oh,
but
thanks.
I think to your point, it was very technical. And it was a lot of it had to do, was focused on international relations,
Sure.
and what exactly did the treaties and the arrangements with Spain really mean and what didn't they mean? It was really focused on that.
Yeah.
And it extended over more than one day.
Oh, I know.
They took
It was one day and
recesses.
four the next, or the other way
Yeah,
around. Yeah.
right. Any
Um,
other scene? How about lines? Any other?
lines. My favorite line, I think, with the British officer when they're blasting the Lomboko slave fortress, he says, take a letter, Ensign, to His Honor, the United States Secretary of State, Mr. John Forsyth. My dear Mr. Forsyth, it is my great pleasure to inform you that you are, in fact, correct. The slave fortress in Sierra Leone does not exist.
I thought that was great. And just as a little side note, who played the Secretary of State in this movie?
Oh yeah.
David Paymer. David
Oh, that's right.
Paymer.
That's right. Ron Ziegler.
It was Ron Ziegler and Nixon. So that's quite a jump. And he was pretty good in this movie. He
Yeah, he
wasn't.
was fine. Although he was, I was surprised to find he's like a South Carolina slave owner. I mean, I'm surprised he didn't have um, a better Southern accent. And the other thing too, that was the kind of this again, Hollywood. The Secretary of State is attending this trial for months at a time, right? I mean, doesn't he have any business back in Washington? What's he doing up in New Haven? Like, and he's actually questioning this prisoners at one point. It's like, well, buddy, you got a day job. I mean, you're not supposed to be hanging around courtrooms, kibitzing on a local DA's prosecution.
There's one more line I thought it was one of the few laugh out loud
Yeah.
lines. It's when the advisors came in to convince Van Buren why he had to
Oh,
get
yeah.
into this case, and because this could cost you your reelection, and there's something even worse than that. And he just blurts out, "What could be more important than that?" And of course, well, the country could get torn apart.
Well, the one part that's kind of funny too is when the Secretary of State and this other guy are talking about John Quincy Adams and how pathetic he is, and he says there's nothing more pathetic than a former president of the United States, and Van Buren just walks in back of them. It's like, you know, thanks a lot. That's what you'll be saying about me when I'm a former president. I liked when the abolitionist objects to Matthew McConaughey making the sort of narrow legal argument. He says, "Did Christ hire a lawyer to get himself off on technicalities? He went to the cross nobly." And Matthew McConaughey says in response that he wants to win the case, and he says, "Hell, sometimes I don't get paid unless I do win the case," which brings us back to the question of worth. In order to do a better job than the son of God's attorney, I'll require $2.50 a day.
That was good.
All
That
right.
was good.
All right. So what we've talked a little bit about what the relevance is to politics and society today. What is your take on that?
I think it shows the American system can work. I think you referenced that. Even back then, it can work. And we need that kind of uplift today. It shows how we can all take, at least I hope all of us, can take the same side on a moral issue without getting our backs up in some kind of culture war or having to invest in a contemporary ideological agenda. It's a pretty straightforward case and moral question, I think. And lastly, I would say that I don't know if this was intentional, probably not. I think it reminds us and reminds me of my belief that in an important sense, the Supreme Court of the United States is the most important institution in our government, bar none. more important than the presidency and more important than Congress when it comes to protecting the rights of the individual against the majority. And I think the fact that the court was able to rule the way it did, perhaps overcoming its natural prejudices at the time, on behalf of individuals, individual rights in a specific case, I think is tremendously relevant today and an important point of the movie.
I think what he's trying to say is that progress can only be made incrementally by building coalitions and insisting on, and by not insisting on getting everything at once. So in politics, I think you actually do need extremes on extremists to to create the pressure, and then you need practical realists to actually cut the deals and make the progress. And we see this today all the time. You've got people who hate the deal cutters because they're always compromising and they're not getting everything they want. I mean, Reagan used to say that he would take 50% of half a loaf and then go back for more later. And nowadays, people just aren't willing to take half. If they don't get 96% of the loaf, then they throw everything up.
But if they weren't there, I think you're also saying,
yeah,
then maybe the deal makers wouldn't be motivated to make a deal at all.
Exactly. So you need both the idealists and the realists are working together. The problem is when you get the idealists actually in power, that's when terrible things start to happen. Do you think this movie could be made today? You've already alluded to it.
I would be worried about the attempt to apply it to modern day concerns. I would be worried that it would make too much of this idea that we're not supposed to show movies where white people help black people. I think that, that's sort of maybe that's why the Jodson character had to be in there, the Morgan Freeman character. Having said that, I think it could be made today because in a way, it's ahistorical. It doesn't age. It doesn't need modern day issue application to be relevant.
Right.
It's just a story, an important story to be told for what it is.
I agree with you that I actually don't think that I'm backing off here. I'm not sure that it could be made today because there's too much opposition to this white savior narrative movie. There was pushback against the movie even when it was made, and since then the historians have really come down even harder and harder on it as time goes on. So, and I think Spielberg was actually aware of it at the time because he made Cinqué the hero of the movie over and over again. They keep saying, "Oh, he's the hero. He's the hero. He's doing it." And
they did liberate themselves.
They did liberate themselves.
Exactly. Now they had a few roadblocks along the way, and it was a white system that allowed them to overcome those roadblocks. But ultimately none of that would have happened. They would have ended up as slaves if they hadn't saved themselves.
Yeah. Okay. If you were a high school teacher, would you assign this movie?
Regrettably, no. I don't think it's age appropriate for high schoolers. I would definitely want it to be seen in college, but I think that it's too disturbing for certain ages of people. And I actually laughed at reminding myself of the very beginning when it showed the R rating, and it's listed smoking and violence, as if smoking a cigarette or a cigar or whatever was on parallel to the Atlantic crossing of captured slaves in terms of a rating. I thought that's the ultimate of political correctness, ridiculousness. Yeah, I think everyone should see it, but at the right age.
Yeah. All right. I think you're probably right. I mean, it was the brutal scenes were extremely brutal. And even in college, if you show it to someone, you're gonna have to give them trigger warnings out the wazoo because I mean it is really horrifying. All
And in
right.
high school, you have enough immaturity that you, and depending on what the demography of your high school is, you have enough foolishness and immaturity that all it would take is for one student to blurt out something, offhanded comment, during or after the movie to
Yeah.
cause a big
Yeah.
eruption of
Yeah.
bad stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. What's the grade? What do you grade it?
A minus for
Yep.
me. I thought it was very good. Excellent. I recommend it to everyone, but be forewarned, it's got a lot of disturbing elements to it.
All right. I'm with you there. All right. Any final closing thoughts on the movie? Okay.
I think we've done it.
All right. Well, in closing, then, I just want to remind everyone that the podcast is available on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, and most podcast platforms. You can subscribe there. Our next episode will be a special edition called The Celluloid Beatles in acknowledgement of the 60th anniversary of the invasion of America, the 60th anniversary of when they were on the Ed Sullivan Show. We'll be looking at how the Beatles have been depicted in film and discussing their impact on American culture. And both Jim and I are diving deep to find out if we can connect the Beatles to any American president. So stay tuned to find out if we can.
Good enough, Gary. I'm looking forward to that. It's a little bit of a change of pace in content from our discussion today, but that's okay because that's life, right?
That's life. All right. Goodbye, everyone. And we'll see you next time.
This is the most important case ever come before this court. Because what it in fact concerns is freedom, the very nature of man. And the proof is the length to which a man will go to regain it once taken. He will break loose his chains. He will decimate his enemies. He will try and try and try against all odds, against all prejudices, to get home.